here's some media coverage from the USA in the 19th century, showing the activities of anarchist campaigners. But at the same time that this was going on, the IED was being widely used by revolutionaries in Russia and by anarchists in Britain, Germany, and elsewhere. Here's T. Lawrence on the right, the destroyer of engines, and Lawrence and the Arabs used a variety of IEDs to destroy Turkish trains during the revolt in the desert in the Great War and break their lines of communication, and then dispersing rapidly after they'd been mounted such a raid. And from the early 1970s, the British Army faced the IED for many years in Northern Ireland, where IEDs became over time more and more sophisticated, but so too did the countermeasures. Now on the bottom end of the slide, you can see an IED consisting of a bucket, an explosive charge, and a whole load of dockyard confetti, which had been dug into a bank to kill British soldiers, and we managed to find that one. Look at the soldier in the top slide. You'd think that he's carrying a radio. Well, it looks like a radio, but it's not. It's actually a signal blocker to defeat radio-controlled detonation. And we used to have a whole range of these covering different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum. So a 12 to 20 man patrol would have half a dozen different variants, which would produce, if you like, a bubble or a cone of protection from remote detonation. Certainly by the end of the campaign in Ireland, the army had a good, thorough system to detect and defeat IEDs and the people who made, transported them and operated them. And my own first personal experience was in 1975, from age 20, when I was hit by a primitive one, which damaged my pelvis and my hearing. How badly was not apparent for some time, but I still need regular chiropractic treatment as well as being stone deaf. Thank you very much, Jerry Adams. The IED really next surfaced as a major problem in Iraq. And here the techniques, training and materials were quite often supplied by the Iranians or the Syrians. And the Israelis had faced similar problems from Iranian and Syrian backing when dealing with IEDs planted by Hezbollah. The IEDs, some of the IEDs in Iraq were enormous, using literally tons of old munitions, like the sort of thing you can see here. I was again hit by an IED early in the campaign. Some people are just born lucky, I suppose, in 2003, which badly damaged my right foot. It was not really until late 2004 and early 2005, though, that IEDs became a major feature of our life in Iraq, causing about 60% of coalition casualties, especially in Baghdad and in the western provinces. In Afghanistan, the insurgency there began by trying to confront NATO and US forces head on in large-scale engagements. And it did this throughout 2006 and 2007. And in the winter of 2007, therefore, what we saw was the insurgency looking at its own tactics, reevaluating what it was doing, and rethinking how it was going to go about business, because its losses were simply not sustainable. They will admit to having lost about 25% to 30% of their fighters in that period. Actually, they'd probably lost half. What they did was they dispersed into a proliferation of small groups, each given a defined area of operation and being highly mobile. And rather than engage in symmetrical battles, their military, administrative, and information operations aimed to dominate Afghan provinces without actually occupying territory. Now, given our counterinsurgency doctrine and practice, that was quite an asymmetry. in military operations against NATO, we saw a shift from 2006 to 2008 and through 2008 from a few large attacks to a much larger number of small and asymmetrical attacks using IEDs, often linked with indirect fire and complex ambushes. And you can see that reflected on the data in the slide. If we look at October 2008, which was the close of the Taliban's fighting season. The fighting season is very seasonal in Afghanistan because of the severe differences in climate. Over that previous year, we saw a 52% increase in significant acts over the previous year, as reported by us. And they were nearly all small events. IED attacks were up by 51%. There were nearly 2,500 attacks compared with 1,500 in the same period in the previous year. And 80% of ours and Afghan security force casualties were coming from IEDs rather than from direct fire weapons. So the IED was not and is not a temporary issue. It was a long-lasting, widespread and enduring problem. The suicide bomber was a subset of this, and I'm going to talk a bit about that in a minute. Behind the Taliban bombers in Afghanistan was Al-Qaeda. And what Al-Qaeda did was to act as a facilitation network for ideology, money, weapons, people, and expertise through its web of contacts around the Islamic world. It was Al-Qaeda actually that provided the groups of fighters and trainers with the technical expertise to construct IEDs, not the Taliban. It recruited, trained, indoctrinated and transported the suicide bombers and their devices. And don't think that Al-Qaeda has gone away. It's been extremely badly damaged and it's been eclipsed by ISIL, but it is still active across Central Africa from Somalia to Mali, Chad and Nigeria, as well as in Syria and in Egypt. The IED became the Taliban and Al-Qaeda's weapon of choice. And it caused very many civilian casualties, far more civilian casualties than it did military casualties. And that was something that was rarely remarked on by the mainstream media, which absolutely loved to attribute civilian casualties to us, the government forces. I could never understand what it was that was so admirable about the Taliban and AQ that the BBC and others were so anxious to praise them and see us fail. The high-profile murder of Benazir Bhutto on the left of the slide there, and there's her vehicle on the right, by a suicide bomber, was an excellent example of how IEDs cause civilian casualties without any indication or interest in proportionality as we understand such things. Yes, it succeeded in killing Benazir Bhutto, but it killed 24 other people and injured very many others. But the advantages to the insurgent are obvious. The technology required is pretty low, the cost is small, and the training bill is relatively easy. They're easy to hide and they're hard to find, and they're low risk, therefore, to the attacker. Next, but yeah, the components are pretty much all commercially available. Commercial explosive can be bought or stolen from quarries and construction companies. Homemade explosive can be made from nitrate fertilizer and fuel oil, which was a favorite trick of the IRA. And if you look at the next slide, Jamie, Iraq particularly, and Afghanistan to a degree as well, were actually littered with thousands of tons of old munitions freely available. And our engineers and bomb disposal people spent years clearing this stuff up and destroying it to prevent it just being used as a mine for IED bombers to attack us. So how these things set off, we saw a variety of methods of initiation, and here are the main ones. And a range of remote initiation devices can be used: simple mobile phones, radios, even the thing that you use to open your electronically operated garage door can be used to set one off. Here's an electric timer, can be either clockwork or electronically programmed, and a simple magnet used to attach the explosive, often to the underside of a car. Go on another one, Jamie. The command wire, usually dug in and used to transmit the initiation signal electronically. We then have, go on one, Jamie. We then have victim operated triggers. Here is a grenade, as you can see, which has a tripwire, which would usually be fishing line or something like that, which is almost completely invisible, and the grenade would be dug into a bank with a thin covering of soil over it. And here's a pressure pad. This one's been set off by unintentionally by a cow, but you go over that, and boom, and that's how I lost my right foot. We also have various remote initiation devices, infrared beams, which I can't show you on the slide naturally, radio, mobile phones, and so on. Now, all of those devices, they're not chronological. They all exist at the same time in the battle space, and that's because they're all liable to countermeasures. And countermeasures can be technical or tactical or a combination of both. So there's always in this business a constant cycle of innovation and countermeasure. Here's a more modern version of what I showed you on the very early slide, which is countering remote electronically operated remote control devices. And the use of that could do one of two things. You could force the bomber to go up the technological ladder and use infrared initiation, for which there are expensive technical countermeasures, or you can force him to go down the level of technology and use a command wire. And there's no technical countermeasure for wires. There's an increased risk of prior detection if you're spotted digging it in, but it's much harder to find. And we also have to understand that many electronic countermeasures are actually just broad spectrum jammers. And so they have as much of an effect on our own communications capabilities as they do on the devices. And so they need to be quite selectively employed. Here's a particularly deadly combination that we saw in Iraq. It's an infrared operated initiation combined with an explosively formed projectile. And you can see the shape charge top left. You can see the way that the charge detonates on the bottom left, and the effect it has on vehicles on the right. And rather than just a huge explosion, this form of device, it fires the shape charge at a very high velocity and a very great heat, and it results in very deep penetration. And because of that, its lethality is extreme. Attacks against British troops in southern Iraq using this method generally had an average of 1.3 deaths per attack plus injuries. The standard munitions or explosive-based IEDs had a lethality rate of less than 0.3 deaths per attack. So this, the shape charge, was 4 times as deadly as anything else. And as their use became more common, we began finding multiple banks of these devices, indicating that their supply was not a problem for the insurgents. And these generally came from Iran. Interestingly, we saw far less of them in Afghanistan because of the way the Iranians calibrated their response to the Afghan insurgency. Another factor which accelerated the threat and the rate of innovation and countermeasures was the internet. The internet and mobile phone technology allowed the rapid transfer of know-how from one group to another across continents and oceans. When I was a young fellow in Northern Ireland, for example, it could take 6 months for techniques used in Lebanon or Palestine to reach the IRA and vice versa. By 2003, this time lag had shrunk to a few days. 5 years later, it was a few hours. Our analysts who studied the dark web could within minutes find detailed instructions on how to build an IED or a suicide vest, join an insurgent group and travel to the theatre of war. Two examples of IEDs that are not static on the roadside but mobile. The first of these is the vehicle-borne IED, which could be anything from a car loaded with a bomb or a boot full of commercial explosive to a big truck. The former were used to cause mass civilian casualties in markets or town centres, usually by one ethnic group against another. And in some cases, these would be delivered in hijacked cars driven by their actual owners, who'd be coerced, often by having their families kidnapped and threatened with death. The latter were used to try to destroy small security bases such as permanent vehicle checkpoints or police stations. And there's both Iraq and Northern Ireland on the slide. Or else to blow away into a larger base, following which an armed group or another VBID could enter the base and inflict casualties. A particularly nasty form of IED, the suicide bomber, which is, if you like, the precision guided munition of the IED campaign, targeted at particular places or people. These normally, as you can see, take the form of a vest packed with commercial explosive, studded with ball bearings or scrap metal on the principle of a claymore mine. The bomber would usually arm the bomb before approaching the target and have a handheld detonation switch, triggering the bomb if released. So if you shoot the bomber and the bomber then automatically releases the trigger, the bomb goes off anyway. And these bombers were often women or young children brainwashed by the extremists and rewarded with large financial gifts to their families, plus, of course, the assurance of going straight to paradise. The devices were often devastating, not least to the bomber, and the only evidence we usually found of him or her would be a pair of shoes and a head. The head would shoot vertically upwards and then fall to earth. Yeah, I've talked about the context and the types of device, but we must understand the IED is a product of a system or network. It's the sharp end, the tip of the iceberg, the bit that goes bang, and there's a lot that goes behind it. The ideological leadership, motivation, finance, command, the technical guys developing and disseminating the technology and looking at the countermeasures. Next, please, the production team who assemble the various devices. Then there's the transportation team who take components and complete devices. And then, just as we have a training organization, so do they. And next, just as we have an intelligence and targeting and scouting organization, so do we, so do they. Then you've got the protection and security team that look after the bombers and actually also will clean up after the attack and take away things that can be used forensically. And then finally, the tip of the spear, the device and the bomber who emplaces and activates it. I think our problem was for a long time in Iraq and Afghanistan that we had forgotten what we'd learned in Northern Ireland. We focused on defeating the device and killing bombers. We had forgotten that this was about the network. We had to develop a network to defeat the network. We had to develop a true anti-IED capability. I tried to develop a methodology as commanding general in Iraq and DCG in Afghanistan to build up a network to destroy the network. And we organized this on 4 lines of operation, destroying the system, defeating the device, enabling our partners, and then deconfliction, which is the 4th one. Looking at the system, you can see the required means there, and it's a very widespread of effort. And what it's aimed at is that there's no sanctuary, nationally or internationally, for those who developed, trained, transmitted, or took part in IED technology and effects. I'd particularly just highlight the legal framework on the second to last bullet. In Northern Ireland, the law was changed in order to give us the initiative. We had to follow that same logic in Afghanistan, in spite of the pressure from human rights organizations, or lose the fight. And much of the business of MI6 or the CIA was in forensic investigation and in the interrogation of prisoners. Defeating the device, again, you can see that a lot of the required means there translate over from the first one. But what we were aiming to do here was to see that our own forces could operate with freedom of movement, that we were fully prepared for the threat, and we could dislocate, disrupt, or defeat attacks, and also that the civilian population could go about their business. And this was very much the business of the land force commander in the theatre of operations. It was also very important here on the third bullet from the top to have a lessons learned process, so that we did not institutionally forget what we knew. A lesson is learned when it results in a change in doctrine, practice, or equipment, and until that happens, it's only identified. A lot of this business of defeating the device depends on having the right density of forces in the theatre. And our historical knowledge tells us that you need one member of the security forces to 50 people in the affected areas. And we never got near that until the surge in Iraq and the last part of the campaign in Afghanistan. And unless you do that, you can never deny the IED bomber freedom of operations. An under-resourced military is the insurgents' biggest ally. Here we're looking at enabling partners, both allies, the local indigenous forces, and indeed to a certain extent civilian agencies. And this was important because we were not going to be there forever, and the locals had to take charge. But you have to take risks with passing on technology because it may well leak. And the proactive media and info campaign is very important in getting people to understand in the theatre of operations that it's civilians who are most at risk from this, not the military. And the final line of operation, number 4, is the business of deconfliction, which is a technical effect with very heavy classification issues. But you have to be serious about the management of the electromagnetic spectrum. And it's commander's business. You can't just leave it to the geeks because we have to have commonly agreed tactics, techniques, and procedures for deployment and employment, and to be able to exchange information on the exploitation of what's going on. Now, of course, for all this to work, someone's got to be in charge, somebody fulfilling the converse role of the enemy's ideological leadership. I was never quite sure who was supposed to do this in the British forces, but in terms of the theatre, this was US Central Command, and Central Command had to delegate resources down to its component commanders, because if you don't delegate, then it's the same as failure to resource. And although the direction has to come from the top, the work is done at a low level. So if you, when you hear reports of military commanders or politicians blamed for deaths and injuries by IEDs because the, quote, right vehicles were not available, please get under the hysteria and remember that there's more to it than simple force protection. I've seen a 70-ton main battle tank put on its back by an IED. There's no silver bullet here, in spite of what some defense industrial companies would like you to believe. The IED is part of a network, a system, and to beat it, you have to have a system that's stronger. Has the IED gone away? Absolutely not. In Northern Ireland, officers from explosive ordnance disposal were called out 229 times between August 2018 and July 2019. MI5 continues to categorize the threat from Northern Ireland related terrorism as severe. And this period included a couple of really quite high profile bombings in Derry and Belfast. It continues in Israel, where, and as in August 2020, the Israeli Defense Forces killed 4 Palestinians planting IEDs along the border with Lebanon. Around the world, with the sole exception of 2017, IEDs have been responsible for more civilian deaths than any other explosive weapon type in each and every year of the last decade. And you can see the figures there that speak to themselves. It rather puts COVID into perspective.